My full name is Dwight Norton Stevens Jr., which in grade school is a drawback, having four names. But I was, what was the second thing you wanted?
The date you were born.
Okay. 5/2/24, May 2nd, 1924. I was born in Martin's Hospital on Madison Street in Seattle. Dr. Martin was an OB/GYN, and I don't know whether there was some connection with my parents, but I wasn't born in Seattle General like a lot of other kids in those days. But anyway, that's where I was born.
And your parents lived?
At that time, we lived at 1546 Alki Avenue, which is now a condominium. And my mother's name was Ethel Walkington Stevens, and she had was from a broken family of 7 kids who her parents farmed out, and eventually they were taken in as they were adopted by usually single parents. And so my maternal grandparents were actually a husband and wife, a minister and his wife, and that's why I'm so straight-laced. I always say. They didn't have much of an influence on my life because they were considerably older than me, and they didn't live in Seattle. I didn't see them much as a child. But there was no kindergarten at Alki Elementary at that time, so when I started school in 1930 at Alki Elementary, I remember sitting in little chairs at tables with Ada Woodhouse and Molly Tracy, and the 3 of us were there, and I was only 5 years old. My father was so intent on me getting ahead in life, he tried to start me when I was 5 years old, and about 10 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Cassidy, the principal, showed up in the room, and we thought that was maybe an introduction. We're going to meet the principal, but he was looking for me, and he took me outside in the hall of the first grade classroom and said, Dwight, how old are you? And I said, 5. And he said, I thought so. He said, you come in the office with me, and believe it or not, he turned me loose. He didn't call home. I lived 1 mile from the school. And but I walked home at 6 years old, and my mother was not surprised to see me. She kind of hunched her shoulders and, okay, we'll try it again next year. And so that was introduction to education. And so I went back the next year and started with all the 6-year-olds, and went to, I graduated from there, I guess you call it, and passed up to the next level in 1936, and then went to James Madison and West Seattle High School.
Let's take you back to your first memories. I think it's pretty unusual for anybody to grow up right at a promontory, at a point. You were very close to Duwamish Head. You lived right across from the water. You were very close to the Luna Park Natatorium.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the place that you grew up, a lot of people think of as a place to go visit.
Oh, yeah.
So describe some of your earliest memories as a young boy on Duwamish Head.
Well, believe it or not, living this close to the Alki community at that time, it was a very lonesome time for me because it was all a single drive. Almost every house was just a rental shack along the beach. There was no bulkhead holding Alki Avenue up or blocking the sea out. The waves came right up to the high tide, came right up to the house. We had driftwood protecting the front of the house. There was a planked driveway out front where cars could get to the property along Alki in that stretch. But I don't really remember those days because I was too young, but I saw pictures in family albums. I have one that I gave to the museum here of me and my dog when I was still a baby. I don't know if I could walk. I was sitting up on a blanket and the dog and I were sitting there together alongside of an overturned rowboat, which was high and dry and would be there until the owner wanted to use it. Nobody ever thought it would get stolen, and it never did. And I do remember it eventually when the bulkhead went in, and I don't remember the year that the bulkhead was built along there, but I remember from that time on we were all lost because they put rocks for riprap to protect the bulkhead, and that was quite a barrier. The only place you could get up onto Alki Avenue from the beach was where the park department had put maybe 4 stairways between Alki proper and Duwamish Head, and I lived between 2 of those stairways, and so all I had to do was walk across the street and down and onto the sand, and to the right of each was all this riprap. But I spent almost all of my time in the water as a child. I loved the water. I was taught to swim when I was 9 years old by a neighbor woman who had 2 boys my age, and she said, "You guys are going to learn to swim when you're," because we live here on the water, and they lived on the water side of Alki Avenue there in the 1300 block at the time. And of course they could fall off their front or back porch into the bay. And so she taught us how to swim 2 days after school was out, and it only took about 3 days, and we all 3 were swimming, and we thought it was great. You know, we didn't think the water was cold. Now you have trouble getting people into it. So anyway, that added to our enjoyment of life, being able to swim, and we're outside all the time. I'd get brown as a berry with a tan every year, and you know, not recommended today. But we were the West Seattle Indians anyway, and I remember going to my sister's house down at 1370 Alki when I was still in school, and my older half-sister owned 1370, and every time company would come, she'd grab the back of my bathing suit and pull it down and expose my white derriere, and to show them that I was really not a native. But at any rate, I just had a great fun. But as I said before, and I wanted to explain what a lonesome upbringing I had, was there were very few kids who lived down there. Most of them were working people who rented a place and wanted a kind of a bohemian lifestyle. And we had some wild neighbors and not too many kids. And there was just enough of us that about a half a dozen of us grew up in a 10-block area. And we were able to deliver the Seattle Star newspaper and do those kinds of things. And when we got a little older, I had a Star route when I was 13 and a Times route when I was 15. So we were real happy when school let out in the summer, because some of the people on Alki Avenue at that time would be hosts to kids out of school from someplace else, and we had more children in the summertime to play with, and we had a good time. And our houses were very lightly built. They were beach shacks that had been thrown up. They had the lots were only 25 foot wide in the 1500 block. And I know the rain ran off of our neighbor's house onto our roof, and went into our gutter, so my dad had an agreement with the next door neighbor that it was his turn to clean the drain or the downspouts on our house because most of the rain came from his house. But anyway, and we had a long 2-car garage under our house, and which led eventually to my mother being seriously injured. My dad went to go to work one morning, and something was, like battery was dead or something on the car, and so in a huff and puff he got out. I don't think he set the brake and left it in gear, and my mother came out later to move the car back into the garage, and she only got half in the car when it slipped out of gear and went in, and she got caught in the door. And she was pretty badly injured and in the hospital for quite a while, but she recovered. And just another happening, I guess, that I can remember. I was about 10 at the time.
When you talk about growing up more lonely because there weren't as many kids there, how do you think that affected your personality and your character over time? Were you more resilient? Were you tougher? Describe. Did you feel at the time that you were lonely, or is this a reflection later on, looking back?
Well, I was only lonesome down there as a child till about age 12, because might have been 11. When I joined the Boy Scouts, then I came up to the Alki field house, which was on the water side here and across from 61st Southwest. And then I joined all the gang from West Seattle, and there was lots of kids here. And they all seemed to be good athletes, and so I got into athletics early, basketball, football, baseball, the whole works. And a majority of the first team at West Seattle, the 3 years I was there, were a bunch of kids that grew up together at Alki. And unfortunately, I wasn't one of the better athletes because I was small. I think when I turned out at West Seattle, the coach let me work out for about 2 weeks. Then he put his arm around me after practice one night and walked off. And he said, "Dwight, would you do me a favor?" And I said, "What's that, Coach?" Ready to go. And he said, "Would you be brokenhearted if I cut you?" And I said, "Yeah, but why?" And I was a running back, at 125 pounds. And he said, "I'm not sleeping well. I see you going down under those piles trying to make an end around with the ball, and I can never see you in the pile. You're always under it." So he said he knew that I didn't have it and wasn't big and strong enough. But so he said, "Did you ever think of being a cheerleader?" And I said, "No, I never did, but there were no girls doing it in those days. We had a yell squad, we called it." And so he said, "Well, they're turning out right now." He and I were walking back to the school from Hiawatha Playfield, and I had on my football gear, and my pads and my knees were banging me on my shins because the pants were way too long for me. And I remember that, and he said, "Well, take a bath and go over there and join them and see how you make out." Well, I was a runner-up. I didn't make it as a sophomore, but I did make it as a junior, and I was on the basketball team as a sophomore and the baseball team as a sophomore and a senior. And so I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of friends, meet a lot of people when you're leading the cheers at Seattle Center, which was the old Civic Auditorium in those days. And so I had, I don't think, in answer to your question, that I really felt inhibited in any way. But it was nice to be around a lot of kids primarily because of one neighbor that I'm not going to mention who was my age, and he was always in the grips of the Seattle police. We saw him mostly going by in the back seat of a police car, and he was a bully, and I only lived about 7 houses from him, and he just kind of used me for a punching bag until he and I were both on the baseball team at West Seattle High School, and he was giving me a particularly bad time one day, probably after I struck out or something. And I took my bat and I hit him over the head so hard that his knees buckled. And from then on, I had no problem with him. And I'm sure I gave him a concussion at the time, but we were good, not good friends, but we were friends after that, and he never did bother me again. So it solved one problem. No, I liked people. I was very gregarious in high school. I was a class rep and a class officer and whatnot on the way, and I was one of only 5 guys that had an automobile at West Seattle High School when I went there. In those days, parents didn't loan kids their cars to go to school. We all walked and rode the streetcar. So I had an automobile that my dad sold me for $35 because it wasn't running, and he'd let it freeze up because it was too tight to put antifreeze in it one winter, and so it sat in a reclining state in our front yard until I bought it from him for $35, and we towed it up to West Seattle High School and did an engine job on it, and I put 46,000 miles on it before I went in the Army. The ignition was hardly ever off for several years. But anyway, we had a great time.
Let's go back to when you were a little younger.
Okay.
And there are things near where you grew up that aren't there anymore.
Oh, yes.
And we've talked about some of them, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. You can bring things up, of course, but
Okay.
but one thing I'd like for you to address is the streetcar.
Okay.
The people only imagine what a streetcar is like today, but we had them all over West Seattle, and one went right by your front door.
Number 1.
So describe the streetcar for me and what it was like to ride on it, what your experiences were like on
Well,
it.
it was an electric car, and it was probably 40 to 50 feet long. Quite a stout rig. It ran on regular railroad gauge tracks, and right up and down the middle of Alki Avenue, and the southbound traffic coming out to the point, or westbound traffic, was on the streetcar was on your left, and if you were going to town, I mean, it was on your left, and vice versa. Anyway, the streetcar, our station was Haller Beach. When you came around from Duwamish Head, the conductor, if you were coming home from downtown on the street, he'd holler, Haller Beach, and then we get up. And years later, when I told people about going to Haller Beach on my way home, nobody believed me, because there's a Haller Lake in North Seattle at 130th, and they said, "Ah, you're way off base. That's wrong." But I had old maps of Seattle at one time that had the Haller Beach stop for the capacity of the streetcars were, I would imagine, about 40. You could get maybe 50 if people would stand up, but there was a vestibule on the front and the back. The floor of the streetcar was lower than the center of the car, and the conductor in front, who ran the streetcar himself, was sitting down lower than the passengers in the middle, so we had a better view than he did, but then he only had to see out the front anyway. But the back was always a place where kids gathered, and usually it didn't take us long to find out that if you got your timing right and you all jumped up and down at the same time, we could get the streetcar to rock and lift the forward wheels off of the track or make it slip when it was snowy or rainy and slippery. Then there was a small streetcar, a trolley, that went from Alki, Harbor Avenue Southwest up to California Avenue on top of the hill, and that was a cable car, and it was counterbalanced, and we could get on it and all run to the back and keep the drive wheels off of the track, and the poor conductor would have to come back and place us all in seats and instruct us that if we got to jumping up and down, we were going to walk from there. And so just kids stuff, and we didn't do any real damage. I think a few unscrewed some light bulbs in the vestibule and tossed them out the back window to hear them pop on the tracks, but other than that, I know I was riding, my greatest memory on the streetcar was going down California Avenue between Seattle High School at Stevens Street and the Alaskan Way Junction, and the guys decided to pants me, and that was taking your pants off. They left your shorts on, but they had my pants, and so I jumped off of the streetcar, and then they ran to the back window and held the pants out for about 2 blocks, and I was running down California Avenue in my shorts. And finally they dropped them on the ground before we got to the junction, but I'm sure I ran 4 or 5 blocks before, almost bare. Again, kid stuff, but I'm smiling as I relate it. And about that time, my mother came along in her automobile, a 34 Studebaker Dictator, and she saw me, and I was standing on the curb putting my pants on, and the streetcar, of course, was gone, so she skidded to a stop and wanted to know just exactly what I was up to, dressing edge of California Avenue about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I told her that the kids pants me, and she said, "Okay, get in the car, I'll get." So she took me home.
Would you? Yeah, I imagine sometimes you would walk, sometimes you'd ride a bike, but sometimes you'd ride the streetcar. What would determine when you would ride a streetcar? I mean, partly was it cost some money.
Oh yes, and times were tough because it was the middle of the Depression, started school in the 30s, and I remember starting in the 1st grade up to about the 4th grade, I was being considered somewhat of a sissy because my father opened his law office in downtown Seattle at 9 o'clock, and he would drive up to the grade school and drop me off and go up over Admiral Way and down to Seattle. And so I walked to school, or I would make some excuse to have him let me off down on Alki Avenue, and I'd walk the last 2 blocks to school rather than be seen getting out of the car at school and being one of the favored ones. But it only lasted for a couple of years. And I was on the safety patrol eventually at Alki, and I used to take the younger kids. My sister is 6 years younger than me, and she went to kindergarten, which had started at Alki School by her time. And so I noticed one day playing marbles at recess time with a friend that I was winning my own marbles back. And I asked this kid, "Where'd you get that marble?" And he said, "Oh, a little girl I take to the bus in the afternoon gave me a whole handful of them." And I said, "Fine, they're mine." He said, "Well, you can win them back." So kids were hard on each other, and they still are. It's something kids do. And I don't know why, because we could have had a lot more fun than we did. There was a certain amount of, not terror exactly, but uneasiness about being alone as a school kid in elementary school. You weren't afraid of being kidnapped, because we weren't worth doing that to, but the point was that if two kids meet one alone, why, just for the heck of it, they kind of punch you out. And either that or you took off and ran faster than they did to get home, and a lot of that went on. But I don't want to. It was part of growing up at the time, and my father was a kind of a hard-nosed guy. He was a lawyer in Seattle, and but he didn't like sissies, and he didn't want me to be one, and he didn't give me boxing lessons or any taekwondo or anything, but to protect me. But he was real unhappy if I seemed faint-hearted about doing anything. So it had to be tough for my dad. Thinking back, it wasn't a lot different. One of our kids came home from school 30 years later after my elementary school day with a bloody nose, and he hadn't done anything. He just got roughed up by the gang. And at middle school, especially at James Madison, we had a missing home in the block right across the street, and you could walk through that vacant lot into the alley, and if any two kids bumped elbows during the school day and had words with each other, "I'll meet you after school, you know where." And there'd be 50 kids over there waiting for them to arrive, and we had fights 3 nights a week, and 3 afternoons a week. I got out of them a lot of times, but I had a paper route and had to get on my bike and get going and get my papers, which saved me probably from some scrapes.
Now, were there houses on the water side of Alki?
Yes, there were 7 of them. And
But your house was not.
no,
Yours is where on the land side.
right?
The houses that were on the water side, would they be south of where Luna Park was?
Yes, farther west, right, southwest. And
It's hard for people to imagine there
Well-
being houses on the water side.
well, when you come up from the Duwamish Head Bend on Harbor or on Alki Avenue, you go a little bit to your left, closer to the hill, and then you make a turn and come almost all the way up to Alki Point in a straight fashion. And just before you got to that turn going west, there were these 7 houses, and the bulkhead, the new bulkhead, cut them off. They built it in back of the homes next to where the street was going to be, and left those homes sitting there. And one by one they were sold, but it took 10 years. And the 7 of them were moved. I know the Schaefers lived there, and the Schaefers had a great big 2-story green house, and they jacked it off onto a barge and moved it to Alki here on 60th. And I just came by there on my way here, and I could recognize the house yet. That belonged to the Schaefers. But the Beaudries lived there, and the Michaels, and a couple of others. I can't remember the rest of their names, and I only knew them because they were paper route customers of mine later.
You had to know all of the customers on your route by name, of course.
Yeah, but you only had a route of about, I think I had 57 papers or something, and I carried it over the back wheels of my bike on each side. So, and I came down over the hill from up on Prince Street on top, and did that side hill and came down Bon Air. Then I came to 59th and did it, and then turned around and went home. And by the time I got home, I was out of papers and out of a job for the day.
Tell me about, describe the Luna Park natatorium.
Oh.
Now, you know, you would have been 7 when it burned. Do you remember this?
No, you're
Luna Park Natatorium,
down at Duwamish Head.
that's 1931 that
Right,
burned.
right,
And then there was the second natatorium called Alki Natatorium.
right here at 59th.
That's the Alki Field House. But then there was another one.
Yeah, the glass top one.
Right.
Right.
Talk about all of those swimming pools. What role did they play? Was that a...
Well, they played a big part for me because I worked there as a child. I was a towel boy in the men's locker room, and then I got at the natatorium, and then I got to swim for nothing. And any free time, if it was appropriate with the natatorium schedule, I got to swim. And then in the winter, in the summer when we were swimming outdoors, everybody was and enjoying the beach. Why, they eventually laid a floor over the pools, and it became a skating rink. And so I worked in handing out skates to skaters there, and but it was a magnificent thing. When you're small, everything is larger, and this had a completely glassed-in roof, but unfortunately it had a steel frame, and the paint didn't hold up being right on the water. And one of the 4 pools was salt water, which just came in through a pipe and right back out, and wasn't heated. And that's where we threw everybody who was, for one reason or another, was unpopular for a few minutes, and we'd cool them off in the unheated pool.
Of course, this is the Alki Natatorium.
That's the Alki Natatorium. The Luna pool, I remember the night it burned, because my brother half-brother was working there at the time, and not at the time it burned, but during that time period, and he ran from home down there because I think he had some personal effects or something stored there, and came home, and the police and fire department wouldn't even let him get near it because they were pretty rudimentary type fire department at the time, and they weren't able to save it. So.
Do you recall the pilings from the old Luna Park, and would you go and scavenge out there at low tide? What?
No, we didn't go on the beach much because it was the piling were only exposed at low tide, but we fished off of the dock for years, and you catch all the bullheads and shiners and whatnot, and we would be fishing laying down, looking through the deck of which had been the deck of the Luna pool.
What would people talk about Luna Park? All the, the Ferris wheel, the carousel, all of the rides. There had to have been stories that people told about
Every
that.
time we told anybody about Luna Park, they'd all look at us like we were crazy, because Luna Park in New York City was very famous. And ours was just a kind of a small version of what they were doing in New York City. But it was a good entertainment site. There were booths and attractions, and the swimming pool was just one of them. And so I don't know if the little bit of concrete bulkhead you can still see there was part of the old pool or not, but we didn't go down that way too much because it was a pretty unsavory place to be when I was a child down at Harbor Island. And so my mother forbid me going around the corner from Duwamish Head and down there, because there was prostitution going on and stuff that kids didn't need to know when they were teenagers, and so we were just I had 3 places my mother said I couldn't go. One was down at Harbor Avenue, the other one was Youngstown, and where the steel mill was, and then out to White Center. Stay out of there, you just join the trouble if you go there. So,
Talk a little more about why those places were trouble.
well, they were inhabited by hard-working, hard-drinking workers. The steel mill gang, as they were known as, and they weren't a gang at all, they were just hard-working guys trying to make a living, but they enjoyed themselves after being in that tremendous heat of the steel plant all day. In the evening, they didn't just have 1 beer or 2, they probably drank a half a case. And they had a lot of unhappy family situations. I had a couple of relatives who lived in Youngstown, which is just below the Alaska Way Junction, really, and there were more divorces and marital problems going on in there, and that's why my mom didn't want me down there. It's just too much going on for kids. I think she said it by saying, "You guys can get in enough trouble on your own."
You mentioned White Center. That's quite a ways further south, but of course you could get that there on the streetcar too.
Oh, we hitchhiked and we walked, and especially in the 4th of July, because it was never, when we were growing up, it was never legal to buy fireworks inside the Seattle city limit. So they all set up, the fireworks stands were all on Roxbury Street at the 100 block level, and so we'd take a big shopping bag and walk out there and spend the money we'd saved or talked our folks into giving us. And it wasn't illegal to fire the fireworks in Seattle, but you couldn't buy them inside the city. So, but White Center had a huge, we thought it was huge, a huge skate rink, which I don't know whether it's just recently been raised or not, but there was also a prize fight arena there, and it was a tough neighborhood. And again, like Youngstown, they had a lot of hard-working people who blew off their steam, and it was just a place to stay out of unless you were looking for trouble. Okay.
Also about living where you were, you alluded to this earlier, that you're up against the bank, and there were a fair number of landslides, I imagine.
That's fair number.
Harsh weather there and the steep hills. Talk about some of the landslides you might have experienced.
In 1934, the hill in back of our neighbor's house slid. It was caused primarily by the fact that the wooden drain pipes under the hill on top, up on Sunset Avenue, had rotted away and began leaking, and the water leaked into the hill and saturated it, and then it slid down. And several times the Seattle Engineering Department excavated our neighbor's backyard or leveled it out and ran pipes underground so his lot was dry. But in 1935, my sister and I were sleeping in a bedroom on the back of our house, which was probably 35 feet from the bottom of the hill. And down came a huge slide into the neighbor's yard, and the slop over on our side poured off of his raised lot into ours, and our bedroom was held up by 2 4x4 posts, and it carried one of them away, and our bedroom took on a decided tilt to the north, and so my sister and I had to scramble out of there. I slept in an old double bed, and she had a single bed, and she was being 6 years younger than me. We just kind of sized up the situation in a hurry and knew it was a place to get out of, but you had to go out of our bedroom through the bathroom to get into the main house. And so we did that, and nobody had to rescue us or anything. We scrambled out ourselves. We had a little pot-bellied stove in the corner of that bedroom. There were no heating ducts or anything in the house, and it was just an addition onto our house after my sister was born that we had the bedroom back there at all. And it was, I would think it was about 11 by 12 and adequate for 2 kids.
What did the slide sound like? What did it feel like?
It roared and it hit the house, and frankly, I didn't know what happened. And we had rusty old window on each side of this bedroom of ours, and they had knobs that you unscrewed, and then you pushed the rod out, and that opened the window out. Well, living on Alki Avenue, everything is rusty, metal exposed, and so that was always a job, getting them completely closed. I remember it snowed one night, and I ended up in the morning, I turned over and I felt wet, and I had snow on my blanket. It wasn't deep, but it had blown in the window, and I was right under the window. So, hey, as a kid, you know, living down there, kind of remote from Alki proper, there were some nice, much more modern homes here in the Alki proper area, and didn't go into their homes. As kids, we all played outdoors, and if you wanted to have a neighborhood friend, you just hollered as you went by his house, or stood out in front and hollered, and they came out. And if they didn't come out, they didn't want to play, I guess, or had something else to do, or weren't home. So that was the way I remember it. And it made it easy, my whole life to meet people. I can't ride in an elevator without talking to the people in it. I was in business for myself for 50 years, and riding up and down the elevators downtown, I always, hey, just mention the weather or almost anything, but just to stand there and stare at the door, and a lot of people do. And if you talk to them, gee, pretty soon somebody's even got a joke to tell, and the whole car is rocking and rolling. But anyway.
That people know today that were around when you were a kid, obviously. Sure. One of them's the lighthouse. Did you ever go to the lighthouse?
Very seldom. It was a Coast Guard installation. It was fenced. They had visiting hours, I think, on the weekend, but it was about 1.5 miles from my house to the lighthouse, and the beach is no good and still isn't any good south of the lighthouse. And so we never wanted to go there anyway. It was so nice to come up and play in the deep sand here at Alki Beach and at the field house. And I spent, from the time I was 12 years old, Boy Scouting and taking part in athletics at the field house and Alki Playfield. And the tennis courts in the winter became not an ice rink, but a skate rink, and we played hockey on roller skates there, and that was always very popular. There'd be sometimes a game with 25, 30 kids in it, all whacking at each other. And go ahead.
Another thing that people don't really realize today, but you certainly lived growing up, was that Alki was truly a business district. You had a grocery store, you had a pharmacy, you had
Charlie Ritchie's
Seaside Pharmacy. Can you just take us on a little tour of Alki Avenue, the business district, when you were a kid?
Okay. Walking southwest from my home on Alki Avenue, the first half mile was just single houses. Came to the turn, then you're at Alki Beach, and that was always taken care of by the park department and had a very nice beach area that was a real good place to get your feet cut, because there used to be a lot of drinking in the 30s at evening parties, and the beer bottles would get broken. So us kids would earn chevrons for our sweater by turning in 500 pieces of glass that we fished out of the sand with rakes. It was kind of a scout project, and you'd earn these things, chevrons to sew on your sweater. They were green and yellow, as I recall. But after he made the turn and came into Alki proper, there was a gas station and an auto repair shop, which I noticed the auto repair shop is still there today. And then you got to a few small businesses. One was a snack bar. I don't know what the others were. Then you came to 59th, and then in 1936 the Spud came to Alki, and that was the best business that ever hit the place. And my sister and I went up there on opening day, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we were there, the owner, one of the Alger brothers, took a thumbtack and he tacked a $1 bill over the door, and everybody, what's he doing? And well, that was the first dollar he ever took in there. It was later put into a frame, and I understand it disappeared maybe more times than once. But we hung out there because the fish and chips were, I don't know, 15 to 20 cents, and were just as good, or if not better, than today. And so kids could afford it. We earned money by doing the neighbors' lawns and projects. There weren't many ways. There was not enough business going up here. Charlie Ritchie's drugstore on the corner of 61st and Alki Avenue was the hub, and the streetcar stopped right alongside of his building in front, and that was the end of the line. The streetcar went by his house and went up and came back out onto Alki Avenue and stopped in front of Ritchie's. And let's see, I can't remember whether there was a streetcar that went south on 61st. I think there was, and there was a bus zone on the east side of this building, or no, the log house restaurant building alongside the drugstore. And you could catch it, and it would go south to 61st and then up Admiral Way. So, yeah.
What made Seaside Pharmacy, Charlie Ritchie's Pharmacy, the hub? I mean, I've heard that he was called the mayor of Alki.
Oh yeah.
And why was that the hub?
Well, I think because he was there so long, and he had two very personable women whose names I can't recall, but they were good friends of my mother. My mother was one of the few gals in Alki who always had an automobile, and she would drive up to Ritchie's drugstore, and but I was always admonished not to hang around and be a loiterer, and I was always busy anyway, so it wasn't a problem for me. But kids like to hang out there because it was a junction point for the transit, and you met a lot of people coming and going. And then after the monument was put in with the replica of the New York City's
the Statue of Liberty.
Statue of Liberty was put on the, it was first down closer to the water and then moved up by the street on about 63rd here. And it drew a crowd. And then, of course, the beach was always a draw, just like it is today. Even in the 30s, we had all these rickety old cars coming out here, and big crowds at Alki. And it was a good business spot for some small businesses. On the opposite end of Ritchie's block was a very successful grocery that I didn't know the owner, but I knew kids that worked there, the Capilotto boys. I think even one of them may have been the owner of the grocery later, after we'd been out of school 30 years. But it was a good business. And the ferry from downtown used to come out and land halfway between 61st and Alki Point. And the old ferry was called the Cross Line. And we used to kind of time ourselves down the beach, because when the ferry was always very prompt on schedule, and we always knew what time it was, whether the ferry was in at the dock, because you know when you're out playing and you're going to get called in for dinner at 6 o'clock or something. If you look up the street, you could tell when it was 6 o'clock or something, because the ferry had been there for 10 minutes, and as kids do. Mm-hmm. And but it was an interesting place. There was another big business area there on Harbor Avenue, which is short of the Alki proper, but there was a shipyard there. There was I worked for Howry's Boathouse for 1 or 2 summers, putting boats in and out of the water for fishermen that were renting equipment. And I know, standing on the docks down there at Howry's Boathouse, I'd go home, and at first I didn't know what the problem was, but I'd come home with a case of sea legs after standing on that floating platform and working, busy, not paying any attention to it. I'd go home and look in the mirror, and pretty soon I was a little back from it, and I was up to it, and I was still rocking like I had been. I'd put in a couple of hours on the float. And served me greatly later, because I've never suffered from motion sickness, and I flew in World War II, so it came in handy not to have that problem.
So into your junior high and high school years, obviously you spent a lot of time up in the Admiral District and at James Madison and at West Seattle High School. What did Alki become when you were older? In other words, would you want to spend more time at school, or did kids who went to Madison and West Seattle, did they want to come down to Alki because it was the beach?
There wasn't that much exchange between the kids, and for me personally, I was involved in athletics in school, 3 sports at first, and I wasn't hanging around school. I was turning out, and then I had to give up my paper route to be able to play. And so when turnout was over and you were all muddy from football, for instance, you'd get in the shower and take your uniform off and stamp it up and down and in the shower and hang it up in the drying room. And it would be stiff the next day, but at least you could read the numbers on it. And but I didn't hang around on the avenue. Today, I know the only place you'll see kids hanging out is around the schools and stuff when they let out, and we didn't have that. Most kids, our folks were not well enough off to give us money, so we almost all worked at crazy kind of job. A lot of it just, I painted neighbors' homes, I built fences for them and everything else, and just to keep busy. And then my mother's friends would sell my services to somebody, and I'd paint their home for $50, paint the whole thing for $50. So kids were a good source of labor at the time. Everything was so inexpensive. Gasoline was 17 cents a gallon at times when they'd have a price war. And I had a 29 Chevrolet as my first car. And I had an ashtray, and I put a donations appreciated or something sign on the front of it. When I'd pick kids up going back and forth to school, they'd get in and take the loose change out of their pocket. It might be 7 cents, and they'd just throw it in the ashtray. Well, 7 cents with a half a gallon of gas. And you could go 10 miles. Well, no, he never got 20 miles to the gallon. The car never did get any better than 12 miles to the gallon. But at any rate, we ran our cars on a shoestring, those of us that had them, and bought used tires, throwaways from the garages that you pulled into, and the guy would sell you this 2 tires for $1.50. I remember I was stalled once, I think it was 4 times in 1 week because of flat tires. And it was just because I was running on rags, as we called them. They're already worn out. But then when I got to making a little better wages, like for painting houses and things, well, I had enough money for gas. And a friend of mine and I applied to work at the West Waterway Lumber when school was out. When we were in high school, we were 16. Matter of fact, I don't think we were quite 16. And they hired us anyway. And I went down and worked a half a day. And then the boss or owner of the mill showed up and checked. He saw us working. And then we were on the green chain fishing logs out of the water with pike pole and dancing around in a very dangerous job. And so he fired us immediately and didn't even pay us. And when my dad came home from work that night, he said, well, how'd work go today at the mill? I said, well, we got fired at noon when they found out we weren't 16. And he said, well, did they pay you? I said, no, they just said we couldn't work there. Well, we'll see about that. So the next morning he got on the phone and called the, if you guys wanted to get in trouble, I just refused to pay these kids their half a day's wages that they earned. And so they paid us, and I had gas for a whole week. So, but little things like that. It was an interesting place to grow up. It was, you learned life young. There was a lot going on in Alki all the time, and the facts of life just kind of were taught to you from experience and by experience and what was going on in the neighborhood. Alki was a great, fun place to grow up, and I loved to swim. I learned to swim from a neighbor, and then I was on the Alki swim team here at the playfield, or the, not the natatorium, the field house, which was across on the water side, you know. And Hess Viney was our swimming coach, and we never did very well at Green Lake in the city finals because we were swimming in fresh water, and we'd been training in salt water, and you're much more buoyant. Your arms were free and buoyant, and we'd set some pretty good times in practice. And when it jumped off the floats at Green Lake in the city finals, they'd come up and all you'd see were the other kids' feet. They'd gone ahead, and they were used to swimming lower in the water and did better than we did. So, but it was great fun and good growing up. And fortunately for me, or unfortunately for the world, World War II started when we were in high school, and so we had no employment problems. We just went out of high school, and I went to 1 quarter at the University of Washington in the summer of '42, and then joined the Army in September and got qualified in the Air Force to go to cadet training and become a pilot. And so it was a good experience for me, and I was lucky enough to go to Europe and fly 33 missions and not get shot down, and came close, but
Can you talk about why you think your parents located themselves on Alki?
well, my dad worked his way through law school at the University of Washington as first a deckhand, then an able seaman, then a mate, and finally, by the time he graduated, he'd spent 4 years on boats like the Iroquois, which was a 125-foot freighter running on the Sound. He became a master of Lake Bay and Sound boating, and he loved the water. And from our front porch, and we had an open front porch on our house down there at 1546, and matter of fact, when my mother's children came home from her first marriage, 3 of them, my older half-sisters and a brother, we all slept in 2 double beds on the front porch and just was surrounded by canvas awnings you could let up and down. So it was great living in a place where you just always had something going on. The view out of our front door was never the same. The boats all move. 5 minutes changes the scenery for you, and we got used to that. But we've lived in so many places since where there was no view.
But you think, I'm taking from what you say, that your father really wanted to be close to the water.
Oh yeah, he loved the water. And he was a scrounger. He never did have a very successful law practice. We have always had enough to eat, but that was about it. But he was a generous guy who helped a lot of people, even gave away his mother's cemetery lots in Seattle to people who had no means to be properly buried and stuff. But he was generous, but he was extremely tight with us. The greatest toy I ever got from him was a bicycle he paid $2 for, and it had died in the sand under somebody's porch. And he heard about it, and so it cost him a couple of dollars for a couple of tires, a can of oil, and I was off. And I never had a small bike. I started with a 28-inch bike, and 26 inches were for girls. I had to wheel my bike down to the beach grocery at 1524 Alki Avenue. They had 2 benches out front under their front windows, and I'd walk my bike down there and then get up on the bench and then get on the bike and push off, and I was good for a while. That didn't last long. I learned how to get on and off it in a week, I suppose, but that's how I started riding a bike, using a bench to mount it. But I don't think I'm keeping on.
Oh, that's all right.
Coursing.
That's all right. That's what editing is for, and
Yeah.
it's
Good.
fine.
Good.
Larry tells me that you have some stories about rum running from Blake Island, and I heard that Ceola Beach Drive was a real route for that, and that's sort of a hidden part of West Seattle.
I think, and it was never admitted, but I think my grandfather had a still going in the woods at Three Tree Point, which is South Seattle, way out west of Burien. And there was a lot of drinking going on in the 30s. We had prohibition in there interfering and changing life completely. And my dad, being a lawyer, spent a good part of his time keeping his friends and clients out of jail during Prohibition, which led to my being employed by the Seattle Rainiers because one of his good friends who had a lot of stills working during Prohibition became the manager of the ballpark when Emil Sick built it. And so I was the ball boy there for 3 years, starting in 1938. And 9. And so in 39, 40, and 41, they won all 3 pennants, and I handed the balls to the umpire for every game for all those 3 years. And I didn't have a uniform on. I had a dinner jacket that said Seattle Rainiers above the pocket, wore black slacks and black shoes, and I didn't even have a seat to sit on. I just opened the gate inward and planted my fanny on it and my feet out on the cinder running path around the field. But no uniforms or anything. But it was a good job. My first Social Security card says my employer was the Seattle Rainier Baseball Club.
You know, I have a very good friend who's the premier Seattle baseball collector, and he has a lot of Rainiers things. Do you still have your jacket?
I know who he is. No,
Dave Eskenazi.
No, that belonged to the ball club.
You had to give that back.
Oh yeah, you hung it up in the room and try not to get it dirty so we don't have to launder it. That was but the ball boy's job was to serve the umpires. And I cleaned their shoes and shined them before every game and got all the mud splatters off of their pants and sent their uniforms out for cleaning if needed. And then I had to take the gloss off of 24 balls every night before the game. That took a lot of dirt and a lot of spit. But it wasn't a very glamorous job, but it was a regular paycheck which kept the old 29 Chev running.
Back to Prohibition and the rum. You were saying that led to your Rainiers job, but were there rum runners from Blake Island over to Three Tree Point or over to Ciolo Beach or where?
I did not witness that. But I was told it was happening, and then because my dad was defending these people and keeping them out of jail, why we heard quite a bit about what was going on at home and just family talk. And but my grandmother and grandfather, grandmother and grandfather were writers, and they even had one of the early day Washington newspapers called The Call out of Port Angeles. And when they thought Port Townsend was going to be the capital of Washington, they settled up there. Well, they came from Iowa in 1888. And so the stories were still running rampant when I was young enough to pay any attention to, or was old enough to pay any attention to them. And there was a lot of things that weren't said in family talk about what was going on due to Prohibition and who was in it and who was not in it. And but there was heavy traffic in boating. A lot of boats were strictly shams for illegal running of rum and whatnot. The Puget Sound was all the way to Vancouver, Canada. The traffic was heavy boating traffic with illegal transportation of liquor. But I didn't witness it personally. I could only hearsay.
But you knew that it was going on.
Oh yeah. It was interesting. And then one of my dad's clients that gave me the job at the ballpark later on, years after, he bought a 65-foot freight boat that belonged to the DuPont Powder Company to transport dynamite to Alaska. And they had the Capon and the DuPont boats, twin boats. They were 65-footers with and they were 65 net tons. And so they were pretty substantial. And this Roy Massey, who became the manager of Six Stadium, he bought one of those, and he didn't have enough money to support it, and so my dad became a half owner by pitching in, and then my dad was handy because he had a skipper's license for Lake Band Sound, and so he could be the skipper. And they rented that boat out on the weekends when I was in high school, and I would serve as a deckhand, and we would take the West Seattle Athletic Club and the Uptown Athletic Club from Seattle's football semi-pro teams, and we would take them all over the Sound. We'd leave Lake Union and go out through the locks in the early morning, take the teams there, and then the teams ate and drank their way home. And we had a huge galley below decks, and they were interesting weekends. I got to sit on the bench during the games. I waterboyed a lot, and it was interesting. But I had no idea and didn't realize what an impact the Prohibition had upon our economy and our society and our lifestyle, right? And my mother abhorred drinking, and because her first husband had gotten drunk and left her in Juneau, Alaska with 3 little babies, and he said he was going down to get some cigarettes, and he got on the boat and came back to Seattle and left her up there. She had to work. She was the Juneau's telephone operator at a PBX board, pulling all the cords in and out for 2 years before she saved enough money to buy boat tickets for she and her 3 kids to come back, and nobody else in the family had any money to send her. And so she was up there 2 years after he decided to go elsewhere. But anyway.
I've got to ask you, this is off topic for West Seattle, but Seattle Rainiers, you knew all of those players then.
Oh yeah, as a matter of fact, I transported a lot of them back and forth to the ballpark at night. Not a lot of them, I could only take 1 or 2 at a time, but Mike Budnick and
Now you said it was 39, 40, and 41 were the years that you were there? Or was it?
I was there 39, 40, and 41, and they won all 3 pennants.
And you were not there in 38?
No, that was the year the
first year.
6 opened, and an Italian kid, not a kid, he was about, he was 22 or 3 years old, named Joe, and he had an Italian last name I can't remember, but he was the ball boy the first year, and then he got something else to do for the 1939 season, and that's when Roy Massey called my dad, and he just inquired, do you think Dwight would like the job? Oh boy, I went for it. And in practice at West Seattle High School, I had all Pacific Coast League balls and broken but repaired professional bats. And West Seattle was never very well off. You know, we supplemented money to the athletic teams in high school through a stamp plan. We sold stamps to the kids. They stuck them in their books, and then they got them into the games free. But that money went to buying extra gear for the athletic teams and whatnot. And Roosevelt and Lincoln were the 2 in town who always had the best uniforms and stuff because they could afford it. Kids from Ballard, West Seattle, and Cleveland, we looked like a bunch of ragtags, and we'd wear the uniforms 4 or 5 years. And Lincoln and Roosevelt got new uniforms every year, and that was the difference in how it worked. And so, yeah, we were from across the tracks in West Seattle. After the war, I came home, of course, and I had married my wife, who was my high school sweetheart,
right,
from West Seattle. We met in Spanish class, and so I did my first 2 years at the U after the war in pre-law. And I got accepted to law school at the U, but dean didn't think it would be good for me to work and go to law school at the same time. My grade point wasn't that high because I had a regular full-time, I was driving truck for the post office at the time, and so he hesitated about letting me start the fall quarter of my sophomore year and or my junior year, and so he said, I don't know, Dwight. I said, okay. He said, if he'd not been a friend of my dad's, they were law students together before World War I and never cared for each other, I gather. And so I just called Father Linden over at Gonzaga University in Spokane, and he said, you got the GI Bill? You've been admitted to the UAW? Welcome to Gonzaga. He said, school starts in 2 weeks. So I said, I'll be there. So we up and moved and rented my house in West Seattle to an old classmate of mine. And so,
You were off.
another story.
Let's
Good.
go eat. Would
Okay.
you like to do that?